Good morning. My name is Richard Flory, and I'm the Senior Director of Research and Evaluation at the USC Center for Religion and Civic Culture. It's a pleasure to be with you, even though it is through Zoom. I've decided, though, that regardless how annoying or tiring Zoom sessions may be, I'm thankful for what it allows us to do in these times when we can't actually meet face-to-face. So my talk today is titled City of Dreams, Los Angeles as a Cradle for Religious Activism, Innovation, and Diversity. In his new book, Becoming Los Angeles, Myth, Memory, and a Sense of Place, author and longtime LA observer DJ Waldy tells us that LA has always been a global city, reaching back to even before it was a part of the United States. That LA is and always has been a global city implies many things, not the least of which is that the culture of Los Angeles has global sources. With that in mind, and as I start this presentation, I'd like you to start thinking about what that might mean in terms of the lived reality of Los Angeles as a global crossroads. Consider, for example, all the people who've been drawn to Los Angeles, whether passing through or making it their home, the organizations or the institutions that have been created here, and what being a global crossroads means beyond simply being a geographic location, but a place. And remember that word, a place, in which all inhabitants and the different groups they belong to interact with not only the location, including the weather and the traffic and all that stuff, but the idea of Los Angeles and how that creates a particular way of understanding and acting in the world. So in other words, how does the lived reality of Los Angeles also function as a way that people and institutions interact in and understand the world? I'll come back to this later, but for now, I want you to start that process, including how you may personally think about and experience Los Angeles. Now, setting the context. My job today is to set the context for what will follow in more detail throughout each of the presentations of this conference. So I want to ask you three questions to help set the context and the meaning of the Los Angeles in general and for religion in particular. So the first question we'll try to address is, how do we define Los Angeles and what does LA represent? Second, why and how does that matter, whether that's to individuals or to institutions? And third, how does religious fit into the LA metropolis? So first, defining LA. So for our first question, two related ideas or areas that we need to consider. First is culture, and the second is geography and diversity, or we could say that the other way around, diversity and geography. All of these inform each other in interesting and important ways, which I'll try to flesh out a bit in what follows. So LA, as many of you probably know and probably have experienced in this way, tends to evoke a love it or hate it response. But the reality is that both can be true and that each have helped to create the cultural identity that Los Angeles has, whether marketed as a commodity like Hollywood, or for the 72 there are more suburbs that all make up the Los Angeles region. And in turn, the particular way of life and perspective that makes it Los Angeles. It is important to pause here on the importance of to note the importance of how Los Angeles is marketed and it's perceived, even by religious groups. So as many of you probably already know, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, LA business people and civic boosters marketed the region as a sort of Edenic paradise with its moderate, always framed as Mediterranean climate, clean environment and the like, notwithstanding the smog that was developing. I'm sure you've also all seen the photos and the renderings of glorious blue skies, orange orchards, beaches, and the like from this time period. I'll show a few of those in the next slide. But this marketing was also done by religious groups, both then and now. In the early 20th centuries, local Bible schools, and there were many, promoted their location in the Los Angeles area, with both the weather and the proximity to beaches and mountains as a way to attract students. And the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, now Biola University, in as early as 1914, framed Los Angeles as a city of destiny. And of course, that city of destiny was what they were hitching their wagon to. They were going to be an organization of destiny. More recently, the Dream Center, and I'll mention them again later on in the presentation, has strategically utilized the image of Los Angeles as a, quote, godless and moral wasteland, as a way to attract young people to come and volunteer in one or more of their many social outreach programs. Note, though, that this is in some ways a return to how most urban areas were described by early 20th century fundamentalists, evangelicals, and Pentecostals. The cities were evil, the cities were corrupt, they were in the cities to do good works and to convert people to Christianity. Now, here's some of the photos, or actually postcards, from that early 20th century time. You'll note the one in the middle. It's probably, I'm sure it's a different Fuller. But the one on the upper right, I want to point out to you because you can't quite see it because of the way I've arranged them. But the caption subtitle says that this is a typical residential drive in Los Angeles. Now, I'm not sure what neighborhood this drive would be typical for, other than a few elite neighborhoods. But also note that the card says in California, that is definitely a representation of Southern California, the palm trees, the mountains, the wide open spaces. These are all part of that marketing that was going on. Now, what is it particularly about Los Angeles that helps us to think about this as a, quote, place? And what's unique to its culture and identity? I think we can identify 5 basic characteristics. First is a chance and a place to start over. So people coming to LA leave behind their families and traditions. Former Mayor Tom Bradley has been quoted as saying, people cut themselves off from their ties of the old life when they come to Los Angeles. They're looking for a place where they can be free, where they can do things they couldn't do anywhere else. Second, Los Angeles is a center of cultural creativity and innovation, which historically has drawn people to media and entertainment industries, but also, and especially post-World War II expansion, the aerospace industry and also supporting industries and institutions like universities resulted in a large pool of culture creators and innovators that often crossed industry lines. And for example, and you may not know this, but advances in aerospace industry made their way into other cultural areas like surfing. Just wanted to throw that in there for you. And in terms of migration and immigration, the pull of economic activity of LA and of reinventing oneself, putting some of these themes together. And perhaps the allure of the glamorous image of Los Angeles is promoted through movies and other media. Fourth, a pluralism and tolerance. As LA was developing into a modern city with people coming from elsewhere, arriving with whatever their own ideas and beliefs and interests might have been, Los Angeles became a fairly pluralistic place. It was dominated by, and has been dominated by, a live and let live culture that tends to say that regardless of whether people fully accept other points of view, everybody allows each other to be there. But this is not without a downside. It's important also to note here that Los Angeles has had and still has its share of racial discrimination and animosity, which is in many ways due to its diversity, particularly when dominant groups are threatened or challenged by other groups. For example, in the 1910s and 1920s, the Klan had a significant presence in the city of Los Angeles. And it is important to note that one local flamboyant pastor, Fighting Bob Schuler, no relation to the Schuler in Orange County, spelled slightly differently. He was the pastor of Trinity Methodist Church, which was downtown, and he was holding Klan rallies at his church in the 1920s. In addition, discriminatory housing covenants have been enacted over time that restricted who could own houses and property based on such classifications as race, ethnicity, and even religion. I grew up in Lakewood, a little town next to Long Beach, right next to the Long Beach airport and what was then McDonnell Douglas, a big industrial employer. And even though the real estate developers who developed the city were Jewish, there were covenants that disallowed Jewish people from owning homes in Lakewood. These tensions remain, particularly in times of rapid social and cultural change, which I'll give you one more example. Stephen Miller, a key advisor to the current U.S. president on immigration and similar issues, was born and raised in Santa Monica, in other words, Los Angeles. And there's a recent book out that argues that his response to the LA pluralism was to seek these other more xenophobic angles, and has bled over into and inspired the xenophobic policies of the current administration. Thus, his experience was not an opening up, but was a closing down. It was a sense of loss, not a sense of opening up. Fifth, and finally in this, is the climate and the physical environment. The climate was sold, as we said, the Mediterranean environment. It was conducive to any number of activities and groups being drawn to the region. The so-called social sprawl, or the physical sprawl of the LA metro area, also means that there has historically been a lot of space to create new communities, selves, and institutions. In other words, you could always move, even if you never did, to another area to pursue a new opportunity, in effect, starting over yet again. So the option was there, at least metaphorically for you. And this, though, raises a current question. in terms of how that might work out, since LA is now largely built out. And there's also stresses on environmental resources like water and what will happen with this population as we engage it going forward. Second, moving to geography and then to diversity. So how do we define Los Angeles? I mean, LA can be any number of things. So it could be the city of Los Angeles, it could be the county of Los Angeles, it could be the entire metropolitan region. For our purposes, we define LA as the 5-county area, including Los Angeles, Ventura, San Bernardino, Riverside, and Orange counties, which together make up the entire Los Angeles metropolitan region. This in turn means that there are many cities, more than 72 from the previous slide, and for subregions within LA that each have their own distinctive identities, yet they all exist within the orbit of Los Angeles and contribute to what Los Angeles is and how it is socially and culturally constructed and organized. Thus, there is great diversity, whether that's race or ethnicity or social class or religion or country of origin, that contribute to the idea and the culture of Los Angeles. On the question of diversity, and I just put together a quick and easy table to get an idea of how the region looks, and then compared that to LA County, and then compare it to the U.S. population. As you can see, I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but you can see that Los Angeles is a majority region, and it's much less white than the U.S. population as a whole, and there's much more diversity and representation across different race and ethnic groups. Now, this is a quick and dirty table because it's once you get into race and ethnic issues, there's lots of cross identification. But this gives you the idea of the diversity, at least in that sense. Now, how do we make sense of this? The cultural geographer Michael Deere, contrasting LA urbanism with the urban theories that emphasize a city center with zones of development emanating from the center, frames Los Angeles as a postmodern model of urbanization that consists of several fundamental characteristics, including a global local connection, a ubiquitous social polarization, and a reterritorialization of the urban process in which the hinterland, that is those suburbs and the exurbs out there, organizes the center. The resultant urbanism is distinguished by a centerless urban form. And in many ways, downtown Los Angeles is irrelevant to most of the people that live in LA. They may or may not go there. It may or may not impact their lives in any real way. So that's really what Deere has in mind here. There is a centerless space. This is contrasted to earlier urban theories that talk about a city center, and then it moves out from there. And this is really modeled on Chicago. LA, Deere argues, is much different. And in his book, The Postmodern Urban Condition, and you have to sit tight for this one because it's a long definition, he describes Los Angeles as a polycentric, polycultural, polyglot metropolis regarded by many as the prototype of contemporary urbanization. It is a burgeoning capital of the Pacific Rim undergoing a simultaneous deindustrialization and reindustrialization. He continues, it is an ungovernable city of intense socioeconomic polarization. We can see this through our daily experiences, where it is said a glittering, quote, first world sits atop an impoverished third world substructure. Los Angeles, he continues, is a collection of theme parks where privatized, partitioned spaces exist for all tastes, communities of industry, leisure, and sexual preference, and so on. The residents, he says, of such packaged dreamscapes event some of the most fantastic consumption patterns in the world, but equally importantly, they have produced a multicultural mosaic in which the existing social contract is under stress. Thus, we could conclude at a minimum, Los Angeles is a region of diversity and contrast across all social, economic, and cultural categories without any central governing authority. This is in an important way, LA, its culture and its meaning is defined through the way that this diversity comes together in everyday life with no one central authority trying to govern everything. Now, I want to return to where I asked you at the beginning, where I asked you to think about what it might mean for understanding Los Angeles through the lived reality of being a global crossroads, and to talk a bit about the importance of place. That is, taking a location or a, quote, space in the language of cultural geographers and imbue that space with meaning and structure, thus a place. A place in this sense is more than just a location where we might happen to live. In this conception, while our perspectives on the world are shaped by many different social and psychological influences, The specific place that provides the context through which we interact with the larger world is of key importance in understanding our ongoing and in developing our ongoing understanding of and interaction with that world. For example, when I was growing up in Southern California in the 1960s, there were still many open fields that had yet to be developed into housing tracts or shopping malls. When the rains came in the winter, these fields bloomed with grass, weeds, and wildflowers. And so these otherwise unremarkable open spaces were transformed into these lush green carpets that were teeming with all sorts of life, with the grass and plants and flowers, but also birds and tadpoles and frogs, which we all went out and collected, right smack in the middle of our recently developed suburban neighborhoods. It wasn't until I was in college and I left Southern California for the first time that my view of the world was that everything came alive in winter. Had I grown up, for example, in Chicago, my view of nature and the way I thought the world worked would have been significantly different. My point isn't about grass or frogs or tadpoles. It's that place, in this case, Los Angeles, produces a certain way of looking at, thinking about, and understanding the world. And both individuals, organizations, and institutions that are located here necessarily see the world through a different lens than if they were, say, in Chicago or New York. In other words, place matters. And this is true about religion as well. And we can talk about that in the discussion when that comes up. But let's talk now about, within that broader context, let's talk now about religion in Los Angeles. First of all, there are over 15,000 religious congregations of all sorts across the 5-county LA region. And that link there is actually a link to a database that we have on our website that includes 3 years of collection. And we did not collect this, but we've made it available. And it's downloadable. It's a Google spreadsheet. You can download it and use it however you like, but it lists about 15,000 congregations of all sorts that you can track them across time and try to figure out who they are. But the problem is that once you put something into a map or into a database like that, it becomes static. And religious groups are not static. They are constantly changing. And so just counting the number of congregations or people who claim some sort of religious affiliation only tells us so much. However, we need to at least start somewhere. So one thing to think about is sometimes people frame LA as a Catholic city. Well, it kind of is. There's more Catholics than any other religious group here. But they're not dominant in any real way in terms of religion. They are a bigger number, but there are actually way more congregations of other sorts of groups, partly due to the way that they organize themselves. But that's not really the point. The point is religion, once it's here, is constantly adapting to the environment, even when its practitioners don't think that it is. And for our purposes, then we have to ask, what effect does being in Los Angeles have on a religious group or on a religious person? So I want to return to those 5 characteristics that I pointed out at the beginning about Los Angeles culture and overlay those, overlaid onto religion. So first of all, in terms of starting over, by starting in a new place and by leaving relatives and traditions behind, people have been free over time to either keep their religious affiliations, often that's helpful to them in terms of finding a community where they can belong and get help, and whether that's spiritual or physical, make new religious associations, or leave them behind altogether and then follow no religion. As a culture creator, LA is the home to the entertainment and other innovative industries, but it also then, by necessity, attracts people who are themselves innovative and who are particularly adept at putting ideas and images together in novel ways, which then inevitably bleeds over into other institutional spheres. We can see this bleed over in the rise of Christian contemporary music in the 1960s and 70s, which really got institutionalized at Calvary Chapel in Orange County, and the different and continually morphing forms of pop culture infused worship in churches, and even through the production values, that is rehearsal and on, that are embedded in in producing these worship experiences. In terms of migration, that is internal, and immigration, that is from abroad, as different groups come to Los Angeles, whether, from Los Angeles or from abroad, they all bring their religion and culture with them and introduce new patterns of thought and behavior, thus contributing to a complex reservoir of religious symbols and practices from which individuals and other groups can choose to either add to their religious beliefs and practices or to create new sets of beliefs and practices. In turn, these beliefs and practices are part of the larger cultural stew. Some are adopted, others rejected, but they are available in the local cultural context. pluralism and tolerance. The result of this large and diverse marketplace of religion, including beliefs, practices, teachings, and symbols, is that it has created a culture where no one religious tradition dominates. And there's an emphasis on coexistence, if not acceptance, among religious groups. The absence of a dominant tradition leads then to weaker religious institutions overall, with no one group having the cultural or religious authority to make demands on the lives of current or potential adherents or on government authorities. You can find in some cities where religious groups have much more power with the in the political scene than they do in Los Angeles. So that's somewhat changing these days. Because all religious traditions have to adjust to the diversity of religious and other groups in Los Angeles, they tend to become more tolerant toward other faith communities, or at least accepting of their presence. Okay, and fifth, the climate and physical environment. The often promoted physical environment, that is the mild climate, Mediterranean climate, beaches and the mountains to inspire and to go and have recreation and fun activities of Los Angeles, provides a context that religion scholar Clark Ruff argues has encouraged different forms of individual spirituality that seems not to have necessarily depended upon close connection with churches, synagogues, and other religious institutions, according to Ruff, which results, he says, in a belief in God or the sacred that, if not so much dismissed, as regarded as a personal choice, often disconnected from communal ritual. Now, I would extend this to suggest that individual spirituality, or lack thereof, whether within a religious institution like a church or on one's own, the primacy of the individual and his or her beliefs and practices has replaced the religious authority of the institution. Individuals, even in churches, take what they want and generally leave the rest behind as a matter of, per Ruff, personal choice. Now, what does this look like in terms of religion in Los Angeles? Now, this table, I just put this together to give you an idea of the kind of range of religious expressions that have originated or at least become well known in Southern California and taken on a Southern California or Los Angeles hue to them. And so we want to focus on the left column, but I do want to point out that on the right column, the top one on the Self-Realization Fellowship is now 100 years old. So it's a significant institution in Los Angeles, even if you haven't ever visited or paid much attention to it. It's been around for 100 years. Now, on the left side, starting with Amy Semple McPherson, as is well known, she started and actually built Angelus Temple. She started the Foursquare Gospel Movement. She's well known for her showmanship, the kind of Hollywood connection, and she's a forerunner to what I've often called elsewhere the performance or celebrity model of megachurches, which you can see today in kind of a younger generation of that among Mosaic, Hillsong, Oasis, and another one that's called Church Home, which I never know how to pronounce correctly. In each of these cases, the leaders of these have specifically set out, either come to or set their ministry out in Los Angeles for what Los Angeles offered and what they believed they could do in Los Angeles. Second, Robert Schuller, well known primarily, at least most recently before his death, for the Crystal Cathedral. But really, he got his starts, as many know, but not everybody, in a sort of humble way at a drive-in church, like a drive-in movie theater. What's not also widely known is that there was a simultaneous Long Beach drive-in church led by Pastor Bill Miedema, who was of the same denomination and attended the same seminary at the same time as Schuller, and they undoubtedly knew each other. They each took advantage of the climate and the culture, culture and the climate. You can get in your car all year round for church. And the developing LA region. It was a space where people were on the move, and this was a way to help them come to church even without getting out of their car. Chuck Smith, who founded Calvary Chapel, and as I noted earlier, which was ultimately the hotbed of the kind of hippie Christian countercultural movement and on the Christian contemporary music scene, shifted his ministry to Calvary Chapel from a more traditional church to specifically target Southern California hippies and beach people, even though he was known to say that he didn't particularly like hippies at the time. Rick Warren of Saddleback Church in South Orange County took advantage of this physical environment, the open spaces, the sprawling and newly developing area for his own sprawling campus, and all, of course, the people that were going there. And Matthew Barnett, who founded the Dream Center, had a vision to come to Los Angeles in about 1994. And I'm convinced that this was as a result of the the 92 civil unrest and his casting about to see what he could do in terms of a ministry. He saw an opportunity in Los Angeles. And if you look at his ministry over time, it's been focused on helping people in a variety of ways and not really doing, I mean, they do have a big show for their church services now at Angelus Temple, but primarily it's capitalizing on the LA market or the LA region as a spiritual wasteland that they come to serve others. So the short list leaves out many people and groups, but the point is that these individuals all sought out LA as a place for their religious organizations, and they were able to capitalize on the pluralism and tolerance and having no religious establishment to create successful movements. Each of these leaders capitalized on LA culture at a particular cultural moment in time. The LA advantage was the pluralism and freedom to, quote, do their own thing. And if they were able to create a religious product that appealed to the LA ethos that people were looking for in a church, whether that was a good show, a celebrity sighting, an introspective worship service experience, a way to serve others, or perhaps all or some combination of those, these leaders were able to create their own space within the LA cultural and religious ecology. Now, finally, place matters. I'm not arguing, though, that place is the primary independent variable that causes, so-called, all these things to happen. Rather, that place interacts with individuals, institutions, beliefs, and practices to create a particular way of being in the world. Thus, as this conference progresses, I would encourage you to keep at least the following two questions in your mind. First, how does place provide an additional lens through which to understand the cases and arguments that you'll hear throughout the conference? And second, how is the particular place of Los Angeles important in each of those cases? I look forward to your questions and comments, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.